photographer finds the unexpected when he explores an oasis bigger than most countries in one of the most remote places on Earth.
We're completely isolated. Things happen, and you can surface from a dive and get swept out to sea in no time at all. The real fear is getting lost.
I was a kid from a working-class town in Massachusetts, and I suppose the chances of making a living as an underwater photographer were probably 1,000,000,000 to 1. I can remember as a child looking at the pages of National Geographic magazine on my parents' living room floor and first wanting to be an explorer. So when I was about 14 or 15 years old, I started scuba diving. I bought an old used camera, taught myself how to use it, eventually getting that first assignment for National Geographic.
Brian Scarry has logged more than 15,000 hours underwater, nearly 2 years of his life. Time well spent. His latest assignment for National Geographic will take him to the rainforests of the sea, coral reefs, one of the world's most diverse ecosystems. Reefs sustain more than 4,000 species of fish. They feed, employ, or protect 500 million people. They may even hold the miracle cures of this century, but reefs themselves are sick. Almost 20% of the world's coral reefs are destroyed. Almost half of those left are stressed by runoff, pollution, and overfishing. So where on earth can scientists go to see a healthy reef? To the middle of nowhere. By plane from LA to Fiji. Then by boat for 1,600 kilometers to one of the most remote spots on Earth, the Phoenix Islands. In 2008, the government of Kiribati set aside the Phoenix Islands as the largest marine sanctuary on the planet, an area bigger than Paraguay. Longlining is banned. Instead, scientists fish for data.
You can't just set up marine protected areas and then leave them alone.
Greg Stone leads an expedition from Conservation International, the New England Aquarium, and National Geographic.
So the purpose of this trip is to do a periodic swing through as many islands as we can and dive as many reefs as we can and make as many natural history observations as we can.
The expedition will document the health of the reefs, with the scientists collecting data and Brian taking pictures.
Well, I love being out at sea on an expedition because it's sort of that old romantic notion of, you know, being like Captain Cook or one of the early explorers to the Americas. You sail off one afternoon, and pretty soon you're out in the middle of nowhere.
It takes time to reach the middle of nowhere.
After a while, shipboard life begins to kind of take on a life of its own. All we see is an occasional bird, you know, maybe an albatross or a seagull, and you have a sense of isolation. We rarely have that opportunity to sort of be out there alone in nature, but there are places on the planet that are still like that.
The Pacific fails to live up to its name. For most of the trip, seas run up to 5 meters. After 5 days, landfall.
So here we are at Nico Mororo, the first island that we've arrived at in the Phoenix Islands. This is the island where Amelia Earhart supposedly went down. There's kind of a coral flat here that might have been a place where she could have landed, but no provenance, no hard evidence. Maybe we'll find the plane underwater. Who knows? It's taken longer than we anticipated to get here. It was thought that we'd have about a 4.5 day transit, but we've been at sea for almost 6 days, which means we're a little bit behind. I've only got 10 or 11 days, and a normal assignment for me is maybe 10 or 11 weeks. In a place like this, with just a little over a week, it's going to be hard. Thanks, no. I have to spend literally every minute that I can underwater.
I went to the Phoenix Islands expecting to find pretty much what I found when I was in the Southern Line Islands just a couple of months before. I thought that it would be much the same. Beautiful, beautiful, 100% coral cover, 80% hard coral cover, lots of sharks, some fish schools, the usual suspects. We get out to the Phoenix Island, and what do we find? Lots of coral, but it's all dead. These are supposed to be some of the most beautiful, pristine coral reefs on the planet, and all I'm seeing is dead coral.
The Phoenix Islands sit atop the very source of an El Niño, a cycle of warming water. Normally, that warm water dissipates across the Pacific. But in 2002, an El Niño began here and stayed here.
This place had suffered one of the worst thermal heating events, a bleaching event, on the planet in the last 6 or 7 years, according to the scientists that we were with.
But by now, Brian hoped to see recovery, not ruin.
So dive after dive, I was finding dead coral, just acres and acres of what once was beautiful, spectacular corals that had now all died because the ocean had become too hot and these corals bleached and they died.
For a photographer, a good story means great pictures.
Now it was, well, what's the story here?
Well, it's about 11 o'clock at night. About time to pack it in now. I'm just about 6 days into this assignment. Photographically, it's been a real curveball. We're seeing a lot of dead reef. That doesn't make for pretty pictures. I knew that this was going to be a hard assignment, but it's even harder than I thought. What there have been a lot of is fish.
Live fish amid dead coral.
The corals themselves continue to offer refuge to the fish. Unlike clear-cutting a forest where all the wildlife takes off, there is no refuge, the corals do continue to offer a home to the little fish, and everything still works. You know, it's as if the fish themselves don't recognize that the coral is dead.
But for life to survive, the reef must come back from the dead.
The ocean is a fantastic place to work for a photographer. It represents about 3/4 of our entire planet. And every time you go in the ocean, it's different. It's like looking at a kaleidoscope. It's always changing, there's always movement, there's light, and there's a billion stories there to be told. Trips to the Phoenix Islands are quite rare. You're in a place about as far away from anywhere else on the planet as you can be, and you're having these encounters with wildlife that may or may not ever have seen human beings before. That's pretty special.
A special place, but the same old challenges.
You're in an alien environment. You're completely reliant on life support equipment.
These reefs have a lot of activity, there's a lot going on, but photographically they can be challenging, because my cameras have to go in housings. They're not waterproof cameras. I'm using regular SLR digital cameras.
The other thing about underwater photography is that unlike terrestrial wildlife photographers, underwater photographers cannot use a telephoto lens. We have to get very close to our subjects. Visibility underwater, even in the best places, is never that good, and the ocean acts as a great filter. So unless you're very close, everything's just going to be blue. It's going to be this monochromatic powder blue, and there will be no detail, no color, and no real good resolution. So if we want to bring back and render some of those beautiful colors that we find in the ocean, we have to bring down underwater flashes and strobes.
And you have to bring backup.
By the nature of expeditions, like the Phoenix Islands expedition, you're out there and there's no camera stores, there's no places to go get a AA battery. You have to bring everything with you. So if I bring 12 or 30 cases of equipment, a lot of that is redundancy, it's backup equipment. And sure enough, on day one, I needed it. I plugged in my big fancy underwater lights, my strobes, and lo and behold, some of them were not working.
The final challenge is time.
Underwater, we're probably only given an hour or two, depending on how deep we're diving. I think that one of the mistakes perhaps emerging photographers make underwater is that there's this sense of urgency where they're swimming all over the place and trying to see as much as possible and photograph 100 different subjects on a dive. I would rather sit in one place and photograph one subject over 2 hours, because for me, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. More often than not, if I just pick a place and sit, animals will slowly begin to acclimate to me, and I will begin to become part of the landscape. Now, you're never totally going to be part of the landscape because you're this big wetsuit-clad thing that doesn't really belong there, and you're blowing bubbles with your scuba tank, and you're clanging and making noise. But still, it's amazing that if you just take time and kind of be quiet and sit there, you will begin to see things.
You see music, the harmony of the reef. Herbivores eat algae and make room for new corals to grow. Parrotfish, with their namesake overbite, eat coral. Carnivores keep the parrotfish down.
And all of this stuff works like a well-oiled machine. It's like a Swiss clock where everything just moves in harmony. So when I'm down on these reefs, that's what I'm looking for. I'm trying to see these harmonies, this balance. It's all about seeing, you know? It's all about trying to find those magic moments, those little relationships that I don't really understand. I made a picture in the Phoenix Islands of these two fish that were swimming together, completely different species of fish. They were just kind of working in harmony. I later spoke to a scientist and asked him what was going on, and he said, well, this is shadowing behavior, where the smaller fish is sort of hiding in the shadow of the bigger fish, and he will dart out and eat his prey, you know, every so often when he gets that opportunity. But I was able to make a picture because I was just sort of watching. I was just sort of sitting and being patient and observing.
So it's not enough you got to worry about making great pictures, you also have to worry about getting back to the boat. We're so far away from anything out here. We're no boats, not even fishing boats that we've seen in the days that we've been out here. We're completely isolated. Things happen. Weather comes up, currents that you didn't anticipate get strong, and you can surface from a dive and get swept out to sea in no time at all. So the real fear is getting lost.
Each diver carries a surfeit of safety gear. A pouch holds a light stick, whistle, and mirror to signal the ship. If that fails, they use the safety sausage.
This is about a 5-foot long tube that you can inflate with your scuba regulator or with your mouth if you're drifting on the surface, and by holding it just below the surface, it stands up about 5 feet off the surface of the ocean, allows you to be seen, but gets lost.
Each diver also carries a beacon, visible at night.
And then if neither of those works, then we can use the EPIRB.
An emergency personal locator. Turn it on and it sends a signal via satellite to the U.S. Navy in Hawaii. The Navy then relays the diver's position to the ship. A typical day, up by 6, hit the water. Work. Mid-morning break, dive number 2. Lunch, dive. Break. Finally, a dusk dive.
And I particularly like to dive at that time of day because to me it's perhaps the most interesting time on a reef, when the sun is kind of going down, light levels are dropping, and animals that are typically out during the day are beginning to go off and go to sleep or find a place to hide for the evening, and the animals that come out at night are emerging. And this massive school of surgeonfish that were sort of this beautiful kind of bluish yellow painterly quality to them just was sweeping along foraging. They were wild. I was kind of keeping my distance and watching them as they moved in this beautiful grace along this shallow water environment. And then I kind of moved in and started making pictures. And I'm always fearful that they're going to be disturbed by my presence and just kind of take off. But they sort of allowed me into their world. They were very focused on feeding, and I was able to sort of ebb and flow with them.
Dusk brings out other diners.
I think you do have to have a healthy respect. They are the king of the ocean when you're down there. But by the same token, sharks are not out there just to, menace human beings. We are not on the menu. So I think it's like working with any wild animal. You have to do your homework, and you have to listen to your instincts too. On any given day, you might have a dozen sharks swimming around and everything feels fine, and you sort of get a vibe that says it's okay. It's no different than walking in a neighbor's yard and one dog is sitting there and you get a certain vibe, or it's wagging its tail and you know that's okay. I think you have to listen to that. We can't swim as fast as a whale or a shark or a seal. They could leave us in the dust anytime they want. But the fact that they do allow us to get close and make these pictures, I think says a lot about their tolerance.
A healthy reef needs predators, but sharks haven't recovered from years as prey.
I saw fewer sharks in many of the places that we dived, and that was because we know that in the last 5 or 6 years, there have been longliners here operating and taking many of the sharks out and finning them.
From sharks to snapper, fish are the key to reviving coral.
What we recognized was that even though everything had died for the most part, and that this place had sustained an amazing, terrible event, that life was beginning to take hold again. We were seeing coralline algae, this beautiful pink substrate covering all the dead coral. This is the stuff of life. This is where new corals are going to begin to take hold. And as we looked a little further and dove in other islands, we actually saw this coral taking hold. We saw places that were 20% recovered, 30% recovered.
Yesterday we were at Enderby Island, and the corals looked a lot better. And this morning we just arrived at Phoenix Island. We'll try to spend maybe 6 to 8 hours in the water today and see what we get. We want something to really bring readers into the moment, into these faraway, exotic places. And that's not always easy to do. You might shoot 10 or 15,000 pictures on an assignment like this, but in the end, it comes down to 10 or 12 pictures that are going to be used in the magazine. Those 10 or 12 have to tell a story.
I think sometimes you do know that you just made the picture for the story, the one that you really were hoping to get. And a lot of times it's not the one that you intended to take. But inevitably, it always happens, thankfully, that things happen that I just couldn't predict. I was able to make pictures of fields of dead coral with a single table coral sort of emerging from this death, from this, the ashes. The phoenix was literally rising from the ashes. And to me, that all of a sudden became the story. What we realize is that everything plays a vital role. So as long as the ecosystem is otherwise intact, the corals will come back because the fish are doing their job to keep it healthy and allow and promote that growth. And the best thing you can do is to keep everything else intact. Don't overfish it. Allow those other fish to do their job, and the harmony, the symbiosis, the balance will be restored. I think it's a great message, and it's quite different than what I anticipated as I was sailing out there. It's a message of hope that life will find a way.